Just wanted to acknowledge one of our members. She and her husband and daughter Elaine will be moving very, very soon, and this is her last Sunday with us. Diane Mathis is in the back row. Diane, you want to stand up for a second, right back there? Diane and Jonathan both serve in the United States Army, have been faithful members of the Army for many years. Diane has served overseas, as has Jonathan. And we just wish you well, Diane. I want to thank you for all the contributions that you have made, and Jonathan and Elaine, to the spirit and vitality of our congregation. And we wish you well as you move to Washington State. And let's give Diane a hand. Some of you have heard about the boy named Tyler who missed Palm Sunday because he was sick. And when his family members who went to church that day returned, they were carrying several palm fronds, and 5-year-old Tyler wanted to know what they were. And people held them over Jesus' head when he walked by, said Tyler's father. Wouldn't you know it, the 5-year-old responded, the one Sunday I don't go and Jesus shows up. And most of you know that Kansas State University is a member of the Big 12 conference, a conference which makes up what is known as the Power Five, the Big 12, Big 10, ACC, the Pac-12, and the SEC. They're called the Power Five because they're the highest level of collegiate football in the country. They wield tremendous influence in the arena of intercollegiate sports through television networks and cable channels, not to mention the millions of fans that are attached and drawn to their favorite teams. Now, in Jerusalem, that first Palm Sunday was what I would like to call the Power Five. 5 people, all of whom had tremendous influence in the decision to put Jesus on the cross. Let's go back to the days preceding Palm Sunday and what perhaps was going on in the minds of the disciples. I wondered if Jesus and his closest friends, meaning the disciples, had discussions about the wisdom of Jesus entering Jerusalem when the risks were so high. I can't imagine that at least a few of the disciples didn't advise Jesus to not go into that tumultuous city, teeming with conquering Romans and conquered Jews, not to mention the religious elite that wanted Jesus on the cross. Jerusalem was a cauldron of bitter factions waiting to boil over. One can imagine the heated discussions, perhaps, among the disciples over the advantages and disadvantages of entering the city. But let's go back to the Power Five. As I mentioned before, these 5 people, I'll tell you who they are in a minute, will always be remembered for the decisions they made that Holy Week, that first Holy Week, and the consequential effect those same decisions had on the future of the world. Coach Snyder, in his talk to our young people who attended the Presbyterian of Northern Kansas Youth Rally a couple of weeks ago, as I mentioned last Sunday, he told the young people that we all make decisions with varying degrees of impact on our lives. Many of them, the coach said, just routine daily decisions that have little impact in the bigger picture of things, moderate decisions that have more impact, and some big consequential ones that will have lasting impact on our lives. The decisions that each member of the Power Five made the days before Palm Sunday and Easter, between Palm Sunday and Easter, were decisions that would echo for centuries and still reverberate today. The first member of the Power Five was Judas. Judas was a man who had the passion to lead, but not the courage. He was unsure about what he wanted in life. He savored the idea of being on the inside of Jesus' ministry because of the power he thought might come his way. At times, Judas seemed to be a thorn in Jesus' side, a confrontational person who challenged Jesus when Mary wiped Jesus' feet with that costly perfume, as Reverend Collins mentioned a few weeks ago. And Judas' complaint was, why was this ointment not sold and given to the poor? Jesus said to him, the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. In other words, don't act so self-righteously, Judas, especially when the day of reckoning is near. And then at the end, Judas, of course, fulfilled Jesus' prophecy when he betrayed him with these words to the religious elite, "What will you give me if I deliver him up to you?" Now, in a less dramatic and different way, we are capable of betraying Jesus when we back down from the Christian ideals that we know we are to stand up for. In these situations, betrayal becomes more of a form of convenience, and it's often what we don't do or don't say that defines our disinterest in matters that matter more than we could ever imagine. Caiaphas, the high priest of the religious elite, is also a member of the Power of Five. He qualifies because he was an enormously key player in all the events between Palm Sunday and Easter. I believe Caiaphas carries the most responsibility for Jesus' death on the cross. He and his religious elite brethren clearly set up Jesus for rejection and ultimately crucifixion. When the temple guard captured Jesus and took him to the high priest, Caiaphas said, "He has uttered blasphemy. Why do we need any witnesses?" The kangaroo court was now in session. Having determined that Jesus was guilty of heresy, Caiaphas implied that Jesus was also guilty of treason against Rome, a charge punishable by death in the Roman court. Caiaphas headed up a cynical power play, manipulating his own people into believing that Jesus must die. Theologian Frederick Buechner wrote about Caiaphas, "The high priest Caiaphas was essentially a mathematician. When the Jews started worrying that they might get into hot water because of Jesus' teachings and preachings and overall behavior, Caiaphas said that in that case, they should all dump him like a hot potato." His argument ran that it's better for one man to get it in the neck for the sake of many than for many to get it in the neck for the sake of one. A mathematician. When the people were given the chance to release Jesus or Barabbas, a condemned man himself, the scriptures tell us in Matthew 27:20, "Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the people to ask for Barabbas and therefore put Jesus to death." Caiaphas is an example of a person who resists a good idea on the basis of protecting his own turf and on the presumption that there is no better reward than clinging to power. Instead of inviting open discussion about the idea of a new Messiah, Caiaphas cut it off, and as a man remembered as one who feared the relinquishment of power and who ultimately put Jesus on the cross. The third member of the Power of Five is the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Jesus' case was the last case that he probably wanted to hear. He had enough problems answering to Rome and trying to govern his province effectively and efficiently and to keep peace in Jerusalem. To Pilate, the religious controversy of the Jews had no place in the Roman court. But since Caiaphas and the rest dragged Jesus to him, he had no choice but to listen. Finally, after hearing all the accusations and realizing that there was no basis for any of these charges, Pilate said in exasperation, "I find no crime in this man." But then later, Pilate capitulated to the mob and handed him over to be crucified. Their voices prevailed, as the scriptures tell us. Pilate represents the indifference of those who favor expediency over truth. When it came down to it, Pilate was probably asking himself, "What's in it for me? I fail to see any benefit in releasing this man, Jesus, other than assuaging my own conscience, which will only create problems for me in the end." By doing nothing, Pilate defined himself for eternity. The fourth member of the Power of Five is Peter, the man who seemed to be so squarely behind Jesus and who was so certain in his reply to Jesus' question, "Who do men say that I am? Who do people say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God." And then Jesus said to him, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." But Peter was a little confused about where he should end up in all this. Not unlike many people who are not certain or sure as to where they're supposed to end up. Peter was unsure of himself and about the nature of Christ's kingdom, what it actually meant and what it actually required of him. When Jesus ended up at the temple court for trial and the mob mentality took over, this is when Peter crumbled and collapsed and betrayed his beliefs and uttered his famous denial 3 times. Interestingly enough, friends, we hear less about Peter's tremendous work after Christ's resurrection and his own martyrdom than we do about the handful of verses constituting his denial. By not staring down the mob, Peter's betrayal branded himself for life. And then we have the final member of the Power Five, Jesus himself. What is Jesus really remembered for? He's not really remembered for what we celebrate today, his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We recall it and we celebrate it today because it's a very important part of his ministry, actually going into Jerusalem. But the difficulty with Palm Sunday and its glorious and festive procession is that the glow of it all wears off quickly, because it is what it is. It's a parade, and parades quickly come to an end. To borrow an old expression, Jesus' support was a mile wide in all the shouting crowds, but really only an inch deep, evidenced in the abandonment of his closest friends and the flight of his fair weather followers after the parade was over. But what Jesus is remembered for is the cross that sits on the communion table right in front of me. The cross is Jesus' notoriety, not the parade. Every piece of jewelry with the cross in it, every cross hanging on any wall, anywhere in the world, every cross in every rescue mission in urban America, every cross in every mission outpost in the heart of Africa, every cross in every country where Christianity is outlawed, every cross drawn on concrete walls, every cross written on subway walls and tenement halls, to borrow a Simon & Garfunkel phrase. This is what Christians identify with the most inglorious of all episodes of Christ's life, his death on the cross. Jesus is remembered much more for what happened at the end of the week, as we know, than at the beginning of the week. Jesus is remembered more for what he did on Good Friday, and then subsequently his resurrection. You know, we see evidence of this cross weekly in our fallen soldiers who have sacrificed their lives and the many who are still in harm's way. The firemen, in our country who run into dangerous situations every day. The thousands of family members every day who make big sacrifices for their loved ones. The co-workers who sacrifice their vacation or their sick leave time in order that a co-worker may care for a critically ill or dying loved one. The individual Christian who gives up a significant part of his income in order that children may be fed and clothed, or that a shelter may be built. Thousands and thousands who caringly and consistently carry crosses for those who are struggling in life. John Calvin said, Christians were to be a class of people born to endure affronts and injuries, promising themselves nothing during their whole life but the endurance of a perpetual cross. Meanwhile, they must do good to those who injure them and pray for those who curse them. And this is their only victory, said Calvin, to overcome evil with good. Romans 12 tells us, if your enemy is hungry, you feed him. If he is thirsty, you give him drink. Do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. You know, when we look at our lives, that what often turns out to be, what is the most meaningful thing that usually happens in our life? It's usually the sacrifice that you and I make for someone else. Or it's a sacrifice that someone has made for you. Consider the soldiers who have literally fallen on grenades to absorb the blow so that their fellow soldiers could live. One person sacrifices his life so that others could be living. Imagine memories of those who survived the blast and the example they took away from that heroic act. Imagine yourself walking across the street and you were unaware of a speeding car and a stranger rushed to your rescue and pushed you to safety. Yet he was struck by the same car and he died. You know that sacrifice would walk with you for the rest of your life and would change your life forever. Imagine if you were in a food line, let's say in a developing country, and you were way in the back and you hadn't eaten for days. And you were so hungry that you weren't sure if you were going to make it when it came your turn for that bowl of soup. Then all of a sudden, someone in the front of the line comes to the back of the line where you are standing, and he says to you, you take my spot in the front of the line, and I'll take your spot in the back of the line. Let's trade places. Do you think you would ever forget that person? Jesus stood out boldly and bravely among the Power Five by going to the cross and sacrificing himself for you and me. My friends, it's an event when internalized can change your life forever. The parade was only a prelude to the passion of the cross, that cross that demonstrated his incredible love for you and me. May the words of my mouth and meditations of our hearts be acceptable unto thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.